Oh, good morning, class. Sorry I didn't get this posted earlier in the week. Again, I'm sorry that I haven't seen you guys this week. Definitely a lot going on here. What I wanted to do is I basically wanted to go ahead and finish our discussion of the 1920s. That way, when we get back on Tuesday, we can just start talking about the Great Depression, the New Deal, and then honestly probably go ahead and start moving into World War II, which I think should be a fairly interesting time. So here's where we were. I believe the last thing we basically had talked about is we had talked about Charles Lindbergh's life and how he had become a hero, a villain, a hero again. Well, a hero, a villain, a hero, a tragic figure, a villain, then a hero again. Which is a very odd trajectory for anyone's life. We also, I think, talked about how this was a lost generation. I had mentioned that this was the generation that had come to, basically had grown up during World War I. And so that really, when you see that kind of horrific, and you remember World War I was the most horrific kind of violence the world had ever seen up to that point. It's not surprising that those who would live through it would want to rebel, would adopt those hedonistic lifestyles. We talked about Ernest Hemingway the other day being basically the poster child for that. By the way, the only decent thing Ernest Hemingway ever wrote, I think I mentioned the other day, was The Old Man and the Sea. I hated For Whom the Bell Tolls and The Sun Also Rises. I hated those books so very much. So I mention that now because that's going to kind of be important to understand when we look at the rise of fascism in the 1920s, when we begin talking about World War II. It makes it, I think, a little bit easier to understand why people would fall for such things. One of the big things in the 1920s was prohibition. We had talked before about people like Carrie A. Nation and others who really pushed for an end to alcohol consumption in this country. It was very big during World War I because they were able to accuse German brewers of making men inefficient. So now drinking was a German plot to make us stupid and to make us unable to fight. One of the big voices for prohibition was a preacher with the awesomely named preacher Billy Sunday. I assume it was his real name. He was actually a baseball player before. He was one of them born again Christians, you know, who did all the sinning first and then came back and became a preacher and decided that drinking was really bad. He often dined at the White House. He was a friend of John D. Rockefeller, so you know he very much ran in the best circles. On December 15th, 1917, Congress approved the 18th Amendment, which would ban the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverages within the United States. It was ratified fairly quickly on January 16th, 1919. Only Rhode Island and Connecticut voted against this, but alas, they were outvoted and they were stuck. Now, I mentioned before, if you're really interested in Prohibition, definitely check out the Ken Burns documentary. There's a lot of wonderful footage from that. Now, this is going to surprise you. I think Prohibition came about more quickly than Congress thought it would. So Congress had to play catch up. We had prohibited alcoholic beverages, yet we had not defined what alcoholic beverages were. So Congress has to step in and they pass what's called the Volstead Act. That's Volstead. And it said basically anything that had more than 0.5% alcohol was now banned. Now, if you're someone like me who occasionally needs to take some NyQuil to be able to breathe at night, NyQuil banned. In fact, I think there are some quote-unquote near beers that have more alcohol in it than that. Another problem, and they did put forth some money for enforcement, but they never put enough. What it's going to do is it's basically going to lead to organized crime. And in fact, in places like Chicago, organized crime almost toppled legitimate government, though some would argue maybe Chicago has never had legitimate government. We talked about them when we talked about political machines before. But probably the best well-known name for that is Al Capone, who actually at the height of his power was responsible for the St. Valentine's Day massacre, where he was able to get a hold of a paddy wagon, police uniforms. Basically what he did is he went around and he arrested his competitors, but instead of going to jail, they were lined up against the wall and shot execution style. Al Capone will eventually go to prison, but it will be for tax fraud. Now, my favorite Al Capone story is something to do with Geraldo Rivera. Now, I think I probably have mentioned how much I hate Geraldo Rivera, and I'll be happy to explain why in class. But back when the Fox network was new, one of the first things that they did is they had this hour-long live special starring Geraldo Rivera. They had found an old vault that had belonged to Al Capone. And so they do this hour-long build-up, and Geraldo was like, what are we going to see in the vault? It's going to tell us so much. So finally, they're getting toward the end of the hour. They drill in there, they open the vault, completely empty. Which is, frankly, Geraldo Rivera's journalism style. Now, and by the way, Al Capone went to prison in 1931 for tax evasion. Now, what we have all across the country is we have what these things called speakeasies kind of popped up. And that's where kind of, I hate the term regular folk, but that's basically where, see, rich people were able to get alcohol. You know, you could actually get a doctor's note because it was still kind of considered medicinal. There, in fact, was one in Kentucky. There was one bourbon manufacturer that stayed open during Prohibition. Four Roses was the name. In fact, I'm in the town right now. It's here in Lawrenceburg, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm actually in the town of Four Roses right now. I've never tried it. I'm not a big bourbon person, which is sacrilege here in Kentucky. But basically what you would have is the rich people could kind of make their own booze. You know, you got a lot of bathtub gin, things like that. By the way, if you want to see a really funny thing about Prohibition, check out the Simpsons episode where Homer becomes the beer baron. It's really fantastic. Anyway, so you had these speakeasies kind of pop up. These were underground clubs where you could go and you could drink. Now, I do want to talk about one enforcement agent who was awesomely named Izzy Einstein, and that's I-Z-Z-Y Einstein. And the reason he's kind of cool is because he would go across the country and he would bust, you know, speakeasies and illegal drinking and that kind of thing. But what made him pretty awesome was that he took a diary, he kept a diary, and he noted, that's my sister's cat Luna, she likes to meow, and he noted how long it took him to find alcohol in different cities. For instance, it took him 21 minutes in Chicago, and in New Orleans it took him 31 seconds to find illegal alcohol. Now what he would do, once he would get in town, he would hail a cab. He'd get in the cab, and the first thing he would ask the cab driver was, hey man, that was a long flight, do you know where a guy can get a drink? And in the case of New Orleans, the cab driver opened the glove box and he said, right here, what would you like? So that's why that took 31 seconds to find alcohol in New Orleans. But then again, I'm told if you've ever been to New Orleans, that's about how long it does take to find alcohol, period. Izzy will shut down 4,000 speakeasies. But one of the problems with making something illegal is everybody kind of wants to do it. Kind of saw it growing up with smoking when they said kids couldn't smoke. Like so many people in my elementary, middle, and high school were like, I want to smoke because it's cool. Same thing with drinking, because it was now illegal. That kind of became the cool thing to do. Now some will claim that prohibition will lead to an economic boom, and there was kind of one happening, but it was, again, it's one of those things I was talking about the other day, that if you kind of scratch the surface, things looked good on the top, but just underneath, things were definitely going wrong. It'll be 1933 with the 21st Amendment that we will actually repeal prohibition. That was the first constitutional amendment to actually ever be overturned, for better or for worse. Probably for better, because, you know, who needs all that organized crime, right? Another thing that's going on during this time is this is the first era of the Red Scare, where we're afraid of communists. We're also afraid of immigrants again. Now, here's what had been happening with immigration. Over 1 million immigrants had been coming to our country a year up through World War I. After that, it will be less than 200,000 a year. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Immigration Act that temporarily allowed 350,000 European immigrants, but they set quotas on each country on how many people from each country can have. We still have that quotas today, and it's a really weird thing. It actually be codified with the Immigration Act of 1924, which was based, frankly, on some really weird ideas of eugenics. If you're kind of interested in that kind of thing, check it out. I was really not aware of it until a couple years ago, until Rachel Maddow, of all people, did this really long expose kind of explaining what was going on with that. And that's really, I mean, you know, and it's important to kind of know, because the Immigration Act of 1924 is basically still the basis of our immigration today in a lot of ways. Now, this might shock you considering the rhetoric we hear today. We limited European immigration, but we still allowed